Hello, and welcome to my week 3 assignment of Fighting for Freedom. For this assignment, I will be assessing the impact of the war experience on African Americans' ability to expand their freedom and citizenship rights. I will identify the ways in which African Americans used the war experience to push for greater freedom and equality. I will be talking about the circumstances, economic, political, social, and psychological, that coalesced in the early 20th century to enable African Americans to leave the South after World War I. What role did African American women play in these early years of post-war migration? And identifying the ways in which gender and ideas about gender have impacted the lived experience of African Americans. Despite separate but equal policies, thousands of African Americans enlisted for U.S. military service. The Army established 4 segregated units of African American soldiers during World War I, while the Navy at the time accepted very few African Americans. A majority of African Americans served in supply or labor battalions, but a few units went into battle overseas. African Americans composed 13% of the enlisted military, with 350,000 men serving. After the war ended in 1918, a segregated hospital was made available for African American veterans who served in World War I. The hospital opened in 1923 in Tuskegee, Alabama, and continues in service today. African Americans found that the war brought great opportunity, and blacks served in segregated units but suffered widespread racism in the military, with only a small amount seeing actual combat. The 369th Infantry, for example, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, served on the front line of France for 6 months, longer than any other American unit. There were many factors that contributed to African Americans moving out of the South and heading north. In the South, they faced Jim Crow laws and black codes, but in the North, they were given opportunities to work and thrive. African Americans in the South were forced to make their living working the land, which offered little in the way of economic opportunity, especially when crops were damaged. And while the Ku Klux Klan had been officially dissolved in 1869, the KKK still continued underground after that, spreading fear through intimidation, violence, and even lynching of black Southerners. During this time of migration to the North, African Americans actively confronted racial prejudice, as well as economic, political, and social challenges to create a black urban culture that would exert enormous influence in the decades to come. The Great Migration was the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North, Midwest, and West from about 1916 to 1970. When the Great Migration began, a factory wage in the urban North was typically 3 times more than what the black people would get when working the land in rural South. According to this excerpt from Emmett J. Scott, the very fact that Negroes were leaving in large numbers was a disturbing factor. The talk in the barber shops and grocery stores, where men were wont to assemble soon, began to take the form of reasons for leaving. There it was the custom to review all of the instances of mistreatment and injustice which fell to the lot of the Negro in the South. Driven from their homes by unsatisfactory economic opportunity and harsh segregation laws, many black Americans headed north, where they took advantage of the need for industrial workers that arose during the First World War. They left to build new lives and free themselves from not only slavery, but to escape the discrimination. And this is just a graph I found of the percentage of African American population living in American South. And you can see that from the years 1910 to 1930, which is where the time period of after World War I is, that there's a steady decrease in the percentage of African Americans living in the South, and that number just continues to decrease and decrease throughout the years after that. Over 2.5 million African American men registered for the draft, and more than 1 million African Americans fought in the war. They served their country and made valuable contributions to the war effort, earning high praises for their struggles and sacrifices. During this World War, they also experienced discrimination and segregation, but met the challenge and persevered. At the time, racial segregation remained in the armed forces, as well as most of the country. Much of the military establishment believed black soldiers were inferior to whites and performed relatively poor in combat comparatively. But as the Army Air Corps began ramping up its training program, civil rights groups like the NAACP argued that black Americans should be included. Young African Americans who aspired to become pilots met with significant obstacles, starting with the widespread racist belief that black people could not learn to fly or operate a sophisticated aircraft. Although in September of 1940, Roosevelt's White House announced that the Army Corps would soon begin training black pilots, the War Department chose the Tuskegee Army Field in Tuskegee, Alabama for the training site. This training site was located right in the heart of Jim Crow South. During World War II, African Americans still faced discrimination, but were a major contributor in winning the war, and many received awards for their service. Enslaved African Americans did everything they could to free themselves. During the Revolutionary War, many slaves joined the British in exchange for their freedom. When the British evacuated, they took many former slaves with them. Some 3,000 black loyalists were evacuated from New York to Nova Scotia. Some black loyalists were evacuated to London. Approximately 4,000 blacks were transported from London for resettlement to the colony of Sierra Leone in 1787. Also, during the Civil War, when Union armies pushed south, many slaves ran toward Union lines to free themselves. Most of the time, it was up to the slaves themselves to fight for their freedom. People in the South were rarely letting them go free. It was up to them to take that risk and take the leap to head north. More than 500,000 black Rosies worked alongside their white counterparts in the war effort. Coming from all over the United States, these black Rosies worked tirelessly in shipyards and factories, along railroads, in administrative offices, and elsewhere, to fight both the foreign enemy and the familiar enemy of racism at home. For decades, they received little historical recognition or acknowledgement. World War II required the entire population to contribute to the war effort. Once the U.S. entered in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and millions of American men were enlisted into the military, the government had to rely on the women back home to fill domestic war-related roles. At the peak of the wartime industrial production, over 2 million women worked in the war-related industries. For African American women, becoming a Rosie was not only an opportunity to aid in the war effort, but also a chance for economic empowerment for themselves. Already on the move as part of the Great Migration, they sought to leave behind the dead-end, often demeaning work as domestics and sharecroppers in the South. And this is a picture showing the black Rosies in action as industrial workers. For black men and women, slavery was an equally devastating experience. Both were torn from their homeland and families. Both were forced to perform grueling labor, and both were subjected to mental and physical degradation and denied their most basic human rights. Enslaved men and women were beaten mercilessly, separated from loved ones, and regardless of sex, treated as property in the eyes of the law. However, the circumstances of enslavement were different for black women and men. The first slaves to be brought to the British colonies of North America were mostly male. Considering they were more valued workers because of their strength, enslaved men performed labor jobs that ranged from building houses to plowing fields. When the Dutch brought African and Creole women into the New Amsterdam in late 1620s, they did so not to supplement their workforce, but to provide company for their black male slaves. On smaller farms with fewer slaves, women were more likely to perform the same labor as men. Usually, however, especially on larger farms and plantations, fieldwork was divided along gender lines, with more physically demanding tasks assigned to males. Men, for instance, might chop the wood for a fence, while women were put in charge of its construction. Men generally plowed the fields while women hoed. Early on, slave buyers in the colonies turned to purchasing female field hands who were not only readily available but also cheaper. As a result, female slaves eventually outnumbered men in the field forces. The average enslaved woman gave birth to her first child around 19 years of age, and thereafter bore one child every 2.5 years. This cycle was beneficial in some ways to the mother, because while pregnant, she could usually expect more food and fewer working hours. Of course, the burdens, physical as well as psychological, that came with childbearing were enormous and widespread for enslaved women. Throughout the period of slavery in America, white society believed black women to be innately lustful beings, and they were subject to sexual abuse. Expected to put the needs of the master and his family before her own children, the slave mother on a large plantation returned to the fields right after giving birth most often, leaving her child to be raised by others. On a smaller farm, the slave's mothering responsibilities were simply added on top of her other duties. For the love of their children, slave mothers often chose to stay in bondage, while their male counterparts attempted to escape. The female slave was moreover faced with the prospect of being forced into sexual relationships just for the purposes of reproduction and having more children. These are the references that I used. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.